the neural correlates of consciousness, those processes in the brain that correlate most directly with consciousness. You can study that scientifically without having an answer to the hard problem. So I call this the mapping problem. I think of it as one of the easier problems, but I totally agree with Anil that this is a really important problem for the science, and it could well be that as we get better and better mappings, correlations from physical processes to consciousness, somewhere along the way we'll be struck by something, some say mathematical property of the processes in consciousness that leads us to propose, here is a principle that might cross the gap.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the number of theories that people have put forward, and they are replete, right? We have, integrated information theory, global workspace, intensive schema theory. I mean, there are many. Do you have a favorite or one that guides your own thinking about consciousness?
Yeah.
What's that?
I prefer my theory.
Let's hear it.
So the others, I think they all have good points. One of the problems is that all theories of slightly different things, which does make them difficult to compare. So the theory that I tend to favor, it's a collection of ideas really, it's just, I put it in a particular way. It's the idea of the brain as a prediction machine. So arguably it's not really a theory of consciousness at all, because it does not say, these are the sufficient conditions and then boom, consciousness happens. The other theories tend to say something like this.
Yes.
The idea of the brain as a prediction machine goes way back, and it's really this idea that everything the brain does, pretty much, involves it making predictions about the causes of sensory signals, and then using sensory signals to calibrate, to update these predictions. And when it comes to consciousness, the idea is that everything that we're conscious of, whether it's an experience of the world, whether it's an experience of the self, whether it's an experience of free will or volition, is a kind of perception. It's the brain trying to make sense of a situation in some way. And in that framing, every kind of conscious experience can be understood, can be thought of as underpinned by this process of the brain making predictions and updating predictions, but in different ways, in different contexts. The sort of slogan for this is that perceptual experience is a kind of controlled hallucination. That we don't read the world out objectively, we create it, actively construct it.
Right.
But then the way I take it is that doesn't just apply to the world around us, it applies to the experience of being a self within that world, it applies to emotion, it applies to free will, and ultimately it's all about physiological regulation of the body. The reason brains do this prediction is because prediction allows control, and brains evolved, I think, fundamentally to control, regulate, keep the body alive. And that kind of leads, if you pull on this thread long enough, you do get to this intimate connection between how consciousness seems to us and the fact that we are living, breathing, flesh and blood, energy-consuming creatures.
But in the end of the day, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're not imagining that there's anything beyond the physical when it comes to consciousness, and you're not imagining that we need to modify our understanding of the fundamental ingredients that at root make up the physical. It's just a matter of putting it together and getting a deeper understanding of the processes, and somehow in there, an explanation for consciousness will emerge.
Yeah, I think it really should be a last resort to invoke new fundamental principles of the universe, right? I think matter is very complicated. It's not just neurons that turn on and off, and it's not just atoms bouncing around in the void. The resources of this idea of materialism, that consciousness is a property of matter suitably arranged, there's a lot that can be done with that. It seems short-sighted, I think, to say that, well, clearly we could never explain consciousness in terms of things happening in matter, because matter is really, really rich and interesting.
So David, when you think about, you didn't just coin the hard problem, you've been trying to solve the hard problem, for decades. Can you imagine, even if you don't know the solution, the flavors of how the solutions might ultimately look?
Sure, and I think there's a few different candidates, but the basic idea which I tend to focus on is finding some kind of mappings between physical processes and consciousness, and ultimately trying to boil that down to something really simple and fundamental. I like the predictive processing story that Anil was telling about the brain as a prediction machine. But I think in a way that explains too much. It applies just as well to unconscious processes as to conscious processes. It needs to be combined with some other completely different bit of machinery to explain why some states of the brain are distinctively conscious and others are not. And I like a number of the existing theories, like the global workspace theory, as giving you the beginnings of a physical basis for consciousness. But ultimately what I would like is something like in physics, people say sometimes you're looking for laws so simple, you can write them on the front of a t-shirt, right? To be like the fundamental laws of physics. Well, if it turns out that we can't explain consciousness fully in terms of physical processing, then that doesn't mean it's beyond science, but it may mean we need something like another fundamental law or a fundamental principle to connect physical processes to consciousness. And then the question is, will it connect to something like biology? I'm skeptical. I think biology is somehow a little bit too high level in a way. I suspect it's going to connect to something like, if you look at the correlations between consciousness and the brain, it's really the informational properties of the brain that matter and not ultimately the biological properties. If you ask me what I'm really looking for, some kind of beautiful mathematical equation that connects information and computation in the brain to consciousness. There is this integrated information theory that does some of that. I'm actually very skeptical about that for some other reasons, but it's at least trying to do the right kind of thing and coming up with a fundamental principle.